some point, Nathaniel will let me talk and will let me be right. But it
Absolutely
may never happen.
not.
It'll never happen.
Never.
I have things to say too. Hi, I'm Sarah. I am back today on the Dirt Kings Podcast. I am joined today by One Take Nate, Nathaniel Barrett.
Let's start it over from the top.
No! I knew that we were going to start it over. I just had to say
I'm back with Zac Efron.
Alright.
Welcome back to the Dirt Kings Podcast. I'm Sarah. I'm a soil advisor here at AgriTec, and I am joined today by Nathaniel.
Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to talk about a little bit of weather and how it affects today. You know, we've seen a lot of different weather, and you know, I've been around the industry for a little while now. I'm a young guy, but grew up around ag, been a crop advisor for the last decade or so, and excited to be on here and talk a little bit about some effects of rainfall.
Well, we are very excited to have you. Today we're going to be talking about some really pertinent things that have to do with something that most of us across the country are experiencing, and that is heavy rainfall. We have our big drought years. We are in a heavy rainfall year, which is very opposite of most of the country and what we've experienced the past couple of years. So today Nathaniel is going to tell us a little bit, and we'll start with some erosion, you know, when you're losing topsoil.
Right.
I know especially this year, so we have experienced more rainfall this spring than we have seen in previous years by leaps and bounds. I think we're close and pushing 20 or more inches so far of rain this spring. So tell me a little bit about, with my field, whether I'm doing row crop or whether I'm doing hay and pasture, what am I seeing when I'm looking out there and all that rain is falling and I'm worried about my soil health and kind of what's going on with it?
Yeah, you know, it seems like when it comes to rainfall, you've either got too much or not enough.
It's never perfect.
There's no such thing as having the right amount of rainfall, and so it's important to understand the effects of a lack of rain and a lack of moisture and what it does to the soil, to your crop, and to your nutrient, as well as, you know, we pray for rain, we do the rain dance, we do all these things to get the rain, right? But then you got to understand.
Watch the weatherman, look at the almanac.
Then you got to understand what's going on with my crops and my soil and what effect is this going to have on me when I'm getting excess amounts, right? And so, of course, we've all heard the term El Nino at this point. Whether you know you understand that entirely or not, essentially what we're dealing with is very extreme variations in weather, right? And so we're coming out of 2 years of pretty heavy droughts in different parts of the country and transitioning in a lot of parts of the country into a very, very wet spring. Now with this, you know, transition after 2 years of dealing with no water, it's like, man, great, we're getting some rain, right?
Right.
And we're all doing the happy dance until the rain just won't go away.
Right.
And you're like, oh my gosh, I got so much I need to do. I got hay that's laying over out there. I need to cut, need to get
I've got guys
planted.
that can't even get in their fields right now to cut. They've got hay just laying over.
I understand that entirely. We've had to rearrange our entire farm plan this year because of the rainfall conditions and transitioning fields into different crops because of the amount of moisture and the inability to get into those places. And so, yeah, it's very important to look at, okay, you know, if we're getting too much rainfall, how does that affect me today? Mm-hmm. But also down the line, right? Especially when inevitably that dries up, what am I going to be dealing with in the soil that might have changed?
So tell me a little bit about kind of the impact of this on my soil. We've gone from really dry years, and now we're headed straight into not even like what started as we're getting a little bit of rain. We're heavy torrential downpours kind of across the whole south, a lot of snow and wet across the whole north. How is that affecting my soil, my ability to hold nutrients this year, everything like that?
You know, the first and most obvious thing that you can visually see is going to have to do with erosion, right? Too much rainfall all at once is different than too much rainfall over an extended period of time, right? And too much of something all at once can cause pretty big problems, especially, you know, this early in the year, right? So if I'm in an area where I have yet to plant my crop and I'm getting extremely heavy amounts of rainfall in short periods of time, then I'm going to be dealing with erosion, right? And one of the best ways to combat that erosion, you know, we've all heard about cover cropping in terms of soil health for bacteria life and for insulation during the winter, but another added benefit of that cover cropping during the winter is to protect that soil so that those heavy rainfalls in the springtime help to hold that soil together to protect us against those negative erosion effects and losing that topsoil. Because in some areas in the country, you've got a really good thick top layer of soil, right? But
some you don't.
Right, you get into some areas and that first couple inches or maybe 4 inches or maybe even down to just 1 or 2 can very quickly be lost, and then something that you've been working on for years, maybe your generation, to build and take care of, can very quickly end up in the creek, right? That is one thing, first and foremost to think about when planning from one year to the next. And it's tough because you're coming out of a dry year and you're like, man, we've had no rain.
It might be another dry year.
Last thing you're thinking about is erosion control, right? But unfortunately, that's the time you're most susceptible to it. Because when you're coming out of a dry year, you're dealing with a situation where you've probably got decreased plant life and plant structure on the soil itself and increased opportunity for that erosion to happen.
Let's say I didn't get a cover crop planted last year, right?
Sure.
I didn't know enough, or I didn't have time, or it just hasn't been in my farm plans. What can I do right now that is going to help me and set me up for success for this season if I am losing topsoil?
Yeah, that is a really good question. That's a difficult situation to be in, right? It's kind of like asking the question, how do I put fire protection in place once my house is on fire?
Right, once it's on fire.
A little late for smoke detectors.
I should have bought insurance, but...
Right. But what you can do is help to protect your soil against those effects by increasing the soil's ability to take water in, right? And that brings us to the second point that too much rainfall can cause. And so just like when we have not enough rainfall and the soil dries out and you get those large cracks in the earth, right? The reason the earth is cracking like that is what's happening is the moisture that's in the ground as it dries out, it's creating a vacuum, essentially. And we can't have a natural vacuum, so that soil tightens and it comes together. Right, and that space that you see in the ground, those cracks, are where normally you should have moisture.
Right.
Well,
but it's been out into the air.
Now on the
plant.
other side of that, when you're getting a lot of rainfall, you want the ability for the soil to not only take that water in to fill those spaces, but then once those spaces are full, to be able to move that moisture into the earth rather than it moving across the top of the earth, right?
Down
which is what causes erosion, right? Or in some cases, let's say you live in a flatter area, or you have bottom ground or low points. Now what we're really dealing with isn't so much the erosion factor, it's the compaction factor in terms of I've got standing water, right? And now that standing water is causing big problems. And the reason it's causing big problems is because oxygen is very vital for you and me. Right? If I hold your head underwater, you're probably not going to like me very much, and you're probably not going to last very long, right? There is so many living components, not just to the soil, but also to the plant, that rely on that oxygen, right? Just like we do. In the case of the soil, if you have standing water, you're eliminating not only the root zone and its ability to obtain oxygen and to breathe, which can cause not just crop distress, but potentially lead to crop death, as well as too much moisture can kill germination for the same reason. You need that oxygen. The other thing that it can cause is you have a lot of living organisms in the soil that, whether you realize it or not, you are relying on those things to maintain soil health, to create a carbon exchange with the plant that keeps nutrients available in the soil, keeps nutrients mobile in the soil, and too much moisture, and especially standing water on the ground. The problem that you'll start to see is it's killing those off, right? Because they can't breathe either. They need the oxygen as well, just like we do. Unfortunately, the long-term effects that you start to see from that in the soil itself are going to be, you're going to have loss of bacterial life that you need to be able to recover from. And so being able to have solutions in place that help with the incorporation of water into the ground is a necessity. For a lot of row crop farmers, the solution that we've turned to is tiling, right? Which essentially, for anyone that doesn't know what tiling is, you're putting kind of French drains in the soil, so to speak, that allows the standing water on the surface
to be absorbed and going in.
Right, it flows down into these low points into a drain. That drain goes to a creek of some type or water retention and is drained so that the field doesn't have the standing water. For the majority of farmers, tiling is not a financial option or potentially just doesn't make sense for their area.
Right.
And so having solutions in place that provide the same effect, the natural means, is very important. And so one thing that I want to talk about a little bit later on in this podcast is how we can naturally aerate the soil.
Definitely.
To incorporate more moisture into the ground, which in the long term, what that means is we're also going to be able to hold moisture better, right? Because it's almost counterintuitive. You think, well, if I'm taking more water in and able to take more water in over a shorter period of time, well, then it's going to dry out faster, right? I'm not going to hold water as well. When in fact, it's quite the opposite, right? If you think of it like the size of a sponge, right? If I make my sponge bigger, it'll take longer for it to dry out in the sun. You see what I'm saying? But the smaller my sponge is, the faster it's going to shrink up on the pavement and turn into, a hard little brick. And the spongier, the more arid we can make the soil, the more aeration we can add to the soil to create those porous zones between soil mineral. It's going to help you in both these circumstances. That's going to be a really big point that we're talking about today, is the balance of too much water and not enough, and how honestly the solution to both comes back to one point, and that point is increasing the sponginess, the ability of that soil to hold, take in, and retain water.
One thing I do want to, circle back to just a little bit, we had talked last week about kind of the different soil types. You've got some sandier soils, you've got some more clay soils, things like that. So I kind of want to incorporate that a little bit into our talk today, especially when it has to do with kind of the leaching of your nutrients in your topsoil. If I've got, super sandy soil, I'm living on a beach like we had kind of talked about in the last podcast, is that affecting me differently on losing those nutrients, losing that topsoil than say somebody who has a more densely packed soil, who's a little more clay?
So, one thing that you have to take into account is if you have 10 apples and I have 2 apples and we both lose an apple, right? You still have 9 apples and I only have 1.
Yes.
Right? So
I have a couple more apples to feed my kids.
There you go. The soil is very similar in the sense of you're going to get more forgiving in some soil types than you are others, but the loss is not any different.
Right.
We still both
lost an apple.
I just lost 50% of my apples and you only lost 10% of your apples, right? But we both lost apples. And so when you're talking about soil types, if I have a high cation exchange capacity with really good nutrient availability, with really good organic matter, I'm holding a lot of nutrients in that ground versus a sandier soil that's not holding a lot. What we're referencing here is the leaching of those nutrients, right? Erosion is removing the entire soil structure. Now leaching is talking about, okay, so much water is passing through and it's taking phosphorus, it's taking potassium, it's taking magnesium, it's taking calcium with it as it travels downward in this case.
Right. Or off. Some farmers live in states like Pennsylvania with rolling hills that, I mean, you're talking a good amount of moisture, you're losing stuff down that hill consistently.
And I think that goes hand in hand because those nutrients are always moving in the same direction of gravity, right? Whether that be 90 degrees,
straight down or
in some cases
down a hill.
Yeah, at a 30-degree angle. And that's why you'll find on your soil samples that the low points in the field hold more nutrients or have more nutrients than the higher points, right?
Because all my fertilizer I applied to spend a lot of money on went.
And that is part of it. A lot of that fertilizer, erosion is taking it down. And then a lot of that, the leaching is taking it down, right? So it's moving down through the soil structure at almost kind of a curve like this, right? And it's getting deposited into those lower points. Now, if I don't have hills, if I live in a flat area, the same thing's happening to me.
Right.
But what's happening is now those nutrients are moving into lower horizons in the soil. And so what you'll find is your heavier nutrients, for instance, calcium, magnesium, potassium, right? Some of our earth metals or alkaline earth metals, those very heavy atoms, right? And so they're going to be most likely
to be going down.
To want to move down, right? Versus like nitrogen, phosphorus, those are a little bit lighter. You have less tendency for the negative effects on those nutrients, but That's why you'll find in a lot of soils, whether that be the sandier type or whether that be, heavier clay or loamy type soil, that when you get down into the B and C horizon, that you have large deposits of nutrients there, right? You've got a lot of calcium. Or in the instance of one gentleman I was looking at soil test with today, we began his soil test below 6 inches. Right?
Okay.
So we didn't test the top 6. And what we found was a heavy deposit of iron, right, down in the ground. Now the surface didn't have that, but all of that.
But it had all moved down. When
moved down.
we're normally doing soil tests, and we're only really testing the first 6 inches of that soil.
And that's an interesting, little side point to think about too. Is like when you're looking at a soil test and you're looking at 0 to 6, we're not looking at distribution of nutrients, right?
Right.
And so what you're seeing is an average of that nutrient across all of those planes, all that 6 inches. Right, which doesn't seem like a lot to you and me, but to a plant that could be its entire zone that it's gathering its
that it's actually able to get to.
Right, and if a lot of its food is in one area versus another, that can cause issues. But getting back to the main point at hand, a lot of rainfall does mean that you're going to have more nutrient leaching. Right?
Okay.
And so what that typically means, sorry to interrupt you, but
No,
what that
you're
typically means is as you're coming...
At some point, Nathaniel will let me talk, but it
Absolutely.
may never happen.
Or dealing with a year like this one, where, let's say, I've applied all my fertilizer, right? And now I've had feet of rainfall over the past couple months.
Just completely waterlogged.
The thing that nobody wants to realize is a lot of those nutrients that I applied, especially my potassium, are going to be pushed deeper into the soil. And the other unfortunate side of the fact of that is if your magnesium and your calcium are also leaching downward, that's leaving space in the soil for hydrogen to take those cation receptor sites, causing declination in
Your pH.
Right.
Increasing
So
the
heavy
hydrogen.
rainfall years lead, and this is the unfortunate thing, heavy rainfall years lead to a decrease in pH, and overly dry years do the same thing. And the reason is those nutrients are either getting locked up in the soil when it gets too dry and it compacts like that,
Right.
or they're moving down out of that primary zone, and that's leaving us with a negative pH. It's kind of a...
The pH is the hardest part.
It's kind of a lose-lose.
Yeah, we're kind of on a lose-lose.
Yeah.
Basically,
And that's
we need
why-
to soil test a lot, make sure we're sitting right
And that's
on that
why,
pH.
we have to
Heavy
keep up
wet
with
years or really dry years, keeping up with that soil testing.
That's why, no matter what you're growing, you're having to reapply limestone every 3 or 4 years.
Right.
In most cases, because you're always fighting a losing battle there.
Right.
It has less to do with nutrient removal and more to do with nutrient translocation. Now, of course, you have practices, as far as tillage and such, that help to combat some of that nutrient translocation. But what we're not taking into account is if I'm tilling the top 8 inches of the soil, I'm not accounting for the fact that maybe my A horizon is 2 feet thick, right? And that's just the A horizon. Then you get into the B horizon where a lot of those nutrients might be settling out. I mean, I might be able to chisel plow and get some of it back up here, but it's difficult.
But it's mostly settled down.
It is, and that's why we rely so heavily on soil bacteria. The churning pot that bacteria creates in the ground to naturally bring those nutrients back up to the root zone. Because as far as man-made implements go, we don't have a great method.
Way to go.
Right?
about
We
that.
don't. Because
Really looking at relying on the ecosystem that has been there since the beginning of time.
I mean, I don't think I'm stepping out on a limb here when I say God is a lot better designer and creator than
the
we
rest
are.
of us.
And he had a plan in place and an idea in place of how that environment is supposed to function. And of course, we have our ways of helping to encourage that in some areas with implements, and then we have other ways nowadays, thanks to advancements like technology, to encourage that natural process
Well, and that,
to do the same thing.
that ties right into the weather, right? There's a positive and a negative to every side of it. We've got that tie-in of on heavy drought years, our fertilizer's hanging out a little longer. On super wet years, like we're talking about right now, our fertilizer is leaving. So there's always a yin and a yang.
And that's something, and that's something
Everything.
that you really want to account for, is that
Right.
yin and yang that you speak of on years like this of, okay, let's say I'm a hay and pasture guy, right? Which I have hay and pasture ground. I have hay and pasture ground that I applied dry fertilizer to this year.
Yes.
Right? And it's real close by here. And all of this rainfall, unfortunately, has created a situation over there where we put out what we expected to be all of the fertilizer for that piece of ground at the start of the year. I'm not going to have access to 80-90% of that nutrient throughout the majority of my growing season. And so now I'm thinking about, and same goes for like, you know, my corn ground. If I applied a bunch of my nitrogen up front, and now I'm dealing with leaching problems or lack of retention due to the amount of rainfall, now I'm having to look into options such as side dress or foliar feeding
later
to
in
keep
the
those
season to
plants
keep it happy.
fed, right? And so this year will be interesting because one of two things is going to happen. There's only two possibilities, right? You're either going to keep getting rainfall throughout the year or it's going to dry out.
Right.
But regardless of either one of those situations, you're going to be dealing with the repercussions of the amount of rainfall that we've already received at this point.
I had this same situation happen this week. I have a farmer who is doing some corn, and he sent me pictures the other day, and he has obvious effects of nitrogen deficiency happening right now on his corn. We put out what normally in a normal last couple of years would have been a good amount of nitrogen for that start of the season, and we're already looking at coming in with more nitrogen with our second pass, and in addition to it, even more nitrogen to make up for the amount of rainfall that we've received that is, you know, affecting that fertilization that we've done this year.
Yeah, you can't win for losing, I tell you. You know, it's like you finally getting the rainfall, you're getting the things that you wanted so bad, and then
right. We started out so excited. We were like, oh my gosh, it's raining this year. We're gonna get rain, and then as the year's gone on, we're like, all right, that's enough.
Yeah.
We're okay. Spread out a little more. We need to get out in the field. We need to bale some things. We need to, you know, do some fertilizing. We need to plant some of the row crop guys where they're having a hard time even getting planted this year. So that leads us straight kind of into, you know, what I really do want to talk about as well is the effects of this weather on those agricultural crops.
Yeah.
What is that doing in regards to, you know, we've talked a little bit about that on the nutrient side, but tell me a little bit about a disease size. What is it doing to my plant?
Okay, so that's a very good point, and I'm glad you bring that up because it's something that I've actually been dealing with on a piece of my own ground, which is a newer piece of ground to me, and so I haven't had the opportunity to implement a lot of the things that we're talking about, right? As far as moisture control goes. And so I've had some standing water in places. It's led to crop disease, not because like the water's not killing them, but the crop's dying off because of fungal disease.
Okay.
That standing water can create a
breeding ground.
It really can for negativity, right? For negative bacteria.
Not just the mosquitoes,
fungus.
guys.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah. Well, those have been a problem too.
Those are a problem too. More for us than for the plant.
Yeah. But yeah, and so, you know, that's something that you definitely want to take into account as far as the effects of that standing water. You know, we've talked about the negative effects on the soil, but talking about the potential for that, you know, to create growing environments for things you don't want there. For instance, you know, for some of, you know, I've got one piece of ground that I've never had fungal problems with.
Right.
And I was out looking at it this morning, and there are mushrooms coming up all over the place. And it's simply because of the amount of rainfall.
The amount of water that we've got.
Yeah, and the temperature and everything kind of go into that. But that soil is more moist than it should be, and it's now we've got mushrooms popping up, which, you know, the mushrooms, whatever, but that's a sign that if that fungus is growing, other negative funguses can be as well. That is a big thing to take into account when you're talking about, you know, especially for like your legumes, like whether it's peanuts or alfalfa or soybeans, they can be more susceptible. Like these days we've got such bulletproof strains of corn.
Right.
Thankfully
they're pretty hardy.
They're pretty hardy.
They're pretty
right?
hardy. But we have our other crops that aren't.
Yeah.
You know, we've got some oats out there, you've got wheat, hay and pasture.
Your pasture, you know, and your hay ground, it's harder to sometimes see how quickly it can be negatively affected.
Right, because you're always it's always covered up. It's harder to see that.
Right, but you can still deal with crop loss from that moisture and excessive moisture and the environment it's creating. But then especially for like, you know, any of your legumes, if you've got standing water out there, you're creating a breeding ground for problems. And so that's another big thing. It's like, okay, we, you know, forget about all other things aside, being able to ensure that that water's draining so that we're not creating that growing environment for funguses and negative bacteria is equally as important.
Tell me a little bit about if I unfortunately haven't taken all these steps this year, you know, done certain things to make sure that water's draining and it's happening. I'm getting pests, I'm getting things like that. Tell me a little bit about what should I do, or what should I recommend guys that I'm talking to on how to manage that? What are steps that, obviously we can't do preemptive steps at this point, so we're going to have to come in with some post steps.
That's okay.
To manage that.
I mean, even I'm dealing with post,
Right.
Steps, right? I'm sitting here preaching about, what to do.
And the mushrooms that you've got growing out at your field.
And so, but thankfully there are options, right? And there are options that, help to create a situation where you can gain from it, right? Kind of sidetrack for a second, but coming in this year with my own personal property, where my house is, I did a lot of work to create additional drainage.
Yeah.
Because I have a pretty good sized pond there. It's a few acres, and these last couple of years, it's been difficult keeping water in it. And so coming in this year, I was like, okay, I'm gonna take advantage of every bit of rainfall we get. Obviously, not knowing we're gonna get a ton.
Wasn't quite as necessary as you thought it might be, but we took preemptive steps, and that's what we're talking about. Preemptive, and then what to do after.
That's right, but those preemptive steps, we're creating drainage to help fill up that pond and capture that rainfall. Right. We can do the same thing with the soil, even now, as a reactive measure, to say, okay, I'm getting all this moisture, I want to capture it. I want that in the ground, right? And that comes down back to that point we were talking about earlier of the sponge, right? Mm-hmm. Of like, okay, how do I increase the holding capacity of my ground when it comes to moisture? And really what that comes down to is the porousness of the soil, just like the porousness of a sponge. Thankfully, there are options for that, and those are going to be chemical aerators, right? And those are kind of a new thing to the industry. They've only been around the past, that I know of, for the past 5 to 6 years in large acceptable fashion.
Right.
I'm sure people had solutions before that, but those chemical aerators are going to supply you with an option that can be preemptive, right, but can also be reactionary in terms of opening up the soil to create a more porous environment that takes in water, that helps to hold that water, which in turn is going to decrease nutrient leaching, right, as well as erosion, right? Because if I'm taking in the water, it's not running across the top, it's running down, but then if it's running down, but then it's staying in zones more, right, then there's less opportunity for those nutrients to follow it further into the ground, right?
So if I'm newer, to hearing about this kind of chemical aeration and things like that, and we carry a product called Aerate, which is phenomenal, and we'll kind of circle back to that a little bit. If I'm worried about that, like I've been farming for 50 years, let's say, I like the way I do things, but this sounds like an interesting product. Tell me a little bit about how it works. How is that aerating my soil?
To put it simply, essentially you're breaking a lot of the molecular bonds in the soil that hold it tight together, right? And that's kind of where the term, aeration comes from. You're opening it up, you're creating airflow, which has its own whole, necessity as far as oxygen and airflow goes. But it's no different than like this table, right? So like this table is solid, right? Which means if I pour some water on it, that water is going to stay right there, right? It's not going into the table. And if you leave it here for 24, 48 hours, whatever, eventually,
it might ruin my table a little bit, but there's still going to be some there.
Right, and so that is no different than the soil. It's like if you're opening that soil up and you're breaking that bond apart so that it's not so tight and heavy, we're creating space. And so that's all that does. It's kind of similar to like a degreaser or a soap in terms of, the way soap works is it goes in and it breaks bonds down.
Yeah.
Right? It's very similar with a chemical aerator going in, and there's not a lot of negative repercussion from it, right? Those bonds aren't a necessity, right? It's not like, oh, now we're losing ground, right? It's now we're creating a porous environment that allows not only for that water to come in the long run, forget about water, it's creating more nutrient mobility, more nutrient availability.
We're just essentially creating more space. So, kind of tying into your water experiment just now, I overwatered my plant on my desk yesterday because I forgot to water it for like a week. Not good with plants on the desks, but it ended up pouring out the bottom of my thing overnight this morning. It's still there, it's still on my desk. So what do? I take that water and I just scooped it right off onto my carpet. Well, the carpet is more broken apart, it's got more space on it, it's a lot comfier to lay on than if I were to lay on my desk.
So when you poured that water into the plant, right, the soil in the plant's probably pretty dry, right? A lot of that water probably ran across the top and down the edges that shrunk, and that's why it so quickly made it to the desk. Right, and that comes right back to like the soil's ability to quickly react
to absorb it.
right? It's no
And
different.
to really capitalize on the water and the moisture, for example, for this year that we're getting, being able to open up that soil, being able to have that aeration,
Right.
and being able to capitalize on the fact that we have all of that moisture this year, which, it has its drawbacks, but it can also have its huge benefits even moving forwards throughout the rest of the season, say if we didn't receive rain.
Absolutely, because if you think of the ground
summer.
like a reservoir of nutrients, a reservoir of water for the plant, and then how do I increase that reservoir? Then it's a much better mindset and approach to, soil health and soil management in terms of nutrient management and moisture management. So the more we can increase that reservoir's holding capacity, the better it is for us in the long run. So let's say, kind of like we talked about earlier, one of two things are going to happen. Let's say the tap shuts off right now, right?
And stop for the rest of the year.
The ability for your soil to hold moisture is going to be a massive determining factor later in the year, right? Soils that are more porous and more, able to hold that moisture are going to perform really, really well. But soils that weren't equipped and ready to take that water in or hold that water because they're too tight, those are going to dry out the fastest, and you're going to have the biggest issue there, right? It all just comes back to the size of that sponge.
Yeah, definitely. We've got the size of that sponge. Obviously, if I've got super compact soil, I don't have an aeration on it or haven't done one so far, what kind of nutrient dilution am I seeing inside of my plants? What am I losing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. This is probably going to be the most prevalent in hay and pasture or wheat crops, but the reason I go back to hay and pasture is because a lot of rainfall means a lot of grass growth usually, right?
Yes.
Now, if you have to couple that with some sunshine, right?
Right.
But produce a lot of grass really fast. The side effect of that is going to be nutrient density inside of that plant, right? Protein values, and all that comes down to how much of that plant is made up of water, right? It's no different than comparing different vegetables, right? Like if you take a cucumber that's 70%, 80% water, right? You're comparing that to, I'm trying to think of a good comparison, maybe a carrot, right? Or any type of root vegetable that has a much lower water content. You're going to have a different distribution of nutrients between the two. A plant in and of itself, whether it be Bermuda grass, coastal fescue, timothy, whatever, is susceptible to those same effects of it gets a lot of moisture really fast and it grows really quickly. You're going to be dealing with a nutrient, I don't want to say deficiency in the plant, but density. And you will notice that your nutrient levels in the plant itself will be less dense because of that. Once again, that's just more so something to be mindful of as far as feed value goes for animals and those kind of things.
So, we've kind of talked about, the pluses, the minuses, the nutrients, things like that really have to do with all of this rainfall that we've seen. So I really do want to circle back a little bit to some of the technological innovations that we've seen over the last 5, 10, 15 years that we can start putting into practice that we might not have preemptively done enough maybe for this year for the rain, but we had 2 years of drought. Maybe we'll have 2 years of really good weather. So kind of help me understand, what can I do on my farm that is going to help me capitalize the most? Even if I didn't maybe get it done this year, what can I do for next year to really capitalize?
Well, let's break that into two parts. Let's talk about what to do this year and then what to do moving forward. So first and foremost, I think it's important to circle back to the fact that nutrient management this year, unfortunately, you're going to have to take a little bit of a different approach in terms of realizing loss, right? Realizing nutrient loss due to excessive rainfall, which means further application throughout the year, whether that be foliar feeding on your corn, follow-up applications on your hay, more side dressing on a crop. All of those things are things you need to be mindful of, right? Because the last thing you want to do is get to the end of the year and get in the combine and see the negative effects of that then, right? That's the worst time to go, oh, crap. And, a lot of people think, I'm going to soil test at the beginning of the year, or I'm going to soil test, in the fall. And very few people think about mid-season soil testing. But in a year like this, I highly encourage that as we come into the latter part of May, early June through June, think about going out and pulling a soil test. Of course, I'm all for, soil test all the time, right? But in a year like this, it's more prevalent than ever because a lot has changed in that ground. And if if we can't see that until it's too late, until it affects the crop or affects our yield, that's going to be a problem. Right? And so whether it be, okay, I'm going to take a follow-up soil test after my first cutting so I can adjust throughout
my
the
plan
year.
For the rest of the year on
Right.
fertilizer I might need, or
here's
what
what we're
I'm
talking
losing or getting.
We're talking about, a soil test that takes, a few hours out of the day to go and pull, minimal cost at the bottom line, but absolutely can make the biggest difference
On your
in
ROI.
Yeah, I mean, seriously. Like, if that soil test can tell me a bunch of things I did not know before it's too late, that can be the difference between a fantastic crop and no crop.
Right.
And those are, of course, the extremes, but there's a lot of space
There's a
to
lot of
fall in those
variables in the
extremes.
middle, and every variable a lot of times equals a dollar sign, especially
Right.
in this industry.
Yeah.
We know how much losing a couple of bales or losing some bushels can really affect your bottom line.
Right, and we have a massive advantage. 20, 30, 40 years ago when Grandpa was doing this, or in my case, Dad was doing this, the ability to make pivotal decisions throughout the growing season, there wasn't many options for it, right? But nowadays we have the ability to get nutrients onto the plant throughout the year because of the equipment we have and because of the type of nutrients that we have that can be foliar fed, that can be side dressed, that can be
well, also the access that we have, with the internet, being able to find different companies, different things, like you have your local co-ops, which are phenomenal, and then you also have a lot of outside sources that if your co-op can't maybe get to you at that time, maybe they're too busy, they've got something going on, you have a lot more options nowadays as far as where you can go for certain nutrients or what you can do compared to 30 or 40 years ago when you really only had a couple of options.
Yeah, the biggest takeaway is take advantage of those things.
Oh,
right?
definitely.
You want to be able to take advantage of the fact that you have that option, right? And it's tough because, like, you could be sitting here looking at market prices for corn or beans or whatever and going, oh my gosh, spending more money. But sometimes a couple dollars can go a long way at the right time. And timing is a big factor as far as when does that plant need this nutrient? And do they have it when they need it? And then when am I going to get the most out of it based on my application, right? Now it's like, okay, I can use, a significant reduced amount of nutrient, but applied at the right time can go a lot further, right? Which is why that in-season soil testing is a great practice, tissue sampling, sap analysis, those kinds of things. They're tools that we don't utilize enough. Right. That's the nutrient side of things. The soil, your biggest things, you're going to have kind of cleanup to do, right? Which is help them to reinstitute bacterial life in the ground after it's had too much moisture, which, that's where your biological products or prebiotics are going to come into play. And then you have your products such as aerate that you talked about earlier that are chemical aerators that are going to help with drainage, help with the soil's ability to hold that moisture in the ground longer, and create a lot of less headache for us because, if I can get the water to go into the ground quicker where I want it to be in the first place, that means less delays on planting or cutting a hay crop off, etc., right? Which is huge for me.
Oh yeah.
And it's huge for any farmer, especially when it comes down to if I'm loosening that soil up, I'm having so many other positive benefits from root development to nutrient motility, etc. The list goes on and on. And water is the topic today, but the loosening that soil up, that's
it's
one
benefits
of the
on
best things
so many aspects.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought back up, kind of aerate and going out there and applying it and getting it taken care of, because it is one of those products that you can apply after your next cutting. You can still go out on that row crop ground and apply once it's dry enough for you to run a tractor and really capitalize maybe on that not very long of a time you might have between rains this year, but a little bit of time. I had a guy, a farmer of mine, who used that product on an area, it was a low-lying field of his that had standing water in it consistently whenever it rained, and it would take him forever to get out there and forever to do a soil test out there if it rained, or forever to be able to apply any nutrients. He used some of our aerate and was able to get out there. He was able to take a soil test not very long after it rained, which he was shocked that he could even do. After he had done that, went out and was pulling up some of his wheat and looking at his root systems, and because we had loosened that soil, because we had broken apart those molecular bonds in his soil, his roots were able to extend down 12 inches in the soil, like it was going out the bottom of his plugs. And he had told me that he had not seen roots in years that were going that long. Normally he got around 6 inches.
Right, and think about that, right? That means now that wheat has access to
all those nutrients that we were
Right.
talking about that are so heavy, that have just pushed down in your soil. I mean, there's a full gold mine down there just sitting, waiting, of years that you've also probably paid in as well.
Yeah, past investments.
Oh
that we can
man, that
cash in
are
on
just
today.
sitting down in there that you might as
Yeah.
well capitalize, especially in this economy. You know, it's
Right.
a rough year. It's a rough year all the way
Yeah.
around for the pocketbooks. It's a rough year on the market side, especially on the corn side. So being able to capitalize where you can and put in just a couple of dollars and get back a huge benefit from that is really going to make a huge difference this year on what you see at the end of the year.
I agree.
So, you know, I feel like we've had a really good talk today kind of about that weather, about what we're seeing. Is there anything else important that you feel like, you know, our guys and gals out there should hear about before we wrap up today?
You know, I think we've gone over some important topics, and I think we've given, you know, a lot of good information to take in throughout our discussion. The last encouragement I have is, don't hesitate to call a crop advisor or an agronomist or your extension officer and discuss options for, okay, what do I need to do
Here's
the
what I'm
rest of
seeing.
this year
Right.
because of what we've had so far.
Right. Perfect. Well, it was great talking with you guys again on another episode of Dirt Kings. We will have another guest back this week. Thank you to Nathaniel for coming and visiting us with us and sharing his knowledge on a wide variety of things that he knows about. He is a wealth of information. And we will see you next week. The end.
Well done.
Thanks.
That was fun.